destroyed.
The point and purpose of this video is to respond, by way of critique, to one of the more formal defences of The Last Jedi to have disgraced the internet over the last couple of weeks. Dealing specifically with a favourable review published on MovieWeb by an author who seems not to have seen either the original trilogy or indeed The Last Jedi, but touching on some of the broader arguments as well, part 1 of our two-part riposte covered the claims that TLJ attracted the fans' ire merely by being different, before moving on to address the peculiar suggestion that Luke Skywalker's character change was necessary in order that some new complexity be eked out of this allegedly perfect and naively simplistic character. If you missed part 1, the link should be on screen now, and you'll find it down in the description as well. In part 2, this video, we'll address claims made in the second half of said review. Specifically, these are, in the first place, that TLJ celebrates individuality by splitting the 3 protagonists up and, at least according to the author, giving them all equal and equivalently important character arcs. Secondly, the author attempts to argue, with her idiosyncratic style and unique understanding of grammar, that Rian Johnson's direction and vision were fresh.
I like this. I don't know if that's C or C. You're telling me you're going to whip out a...
We'll stick as closely as possible to these points, but admitting that no one article can possibly encompass all the fecal variants of TLJ defense, and by extension no one video can possibly respond to all of them, we may branch out as and where necessary in order to tackle some of the broader points raised or hinted at by the MovieWeb review. Strap in or strap on, as you prefer. The Last Jedi did at least accomplish 1 or 2 useful things. Specifically, it brought to the fore 2 types of people. The first group, those who know nothing about Star Wars but do know that every war must be a culture war, do not concern us in this video. I don't think the reviewer is one of those vaguely cancerous tumours. I don't think it's not apparent in her review anyway that she sees TLJ as a cudgel with which to beat toxic fans. Rather, she's of the second type. People who just don't know anything very much about filmmaking and who wouldn't recognise good writing if Shakespeare was choking them to death on his own manuscripts. On the theory that it's better to attribute bad things to ignorance before malice, I think we can say that this type constitutes a good portion of TLJ's defenders. There is a tendency among those of us on the right side of this argument to mistake proportions with gross figures, to assume that because TLJ was so divisive, it's fair to say without qualification that it is hated. This isn't quite true. Casual viewers, people with no especially deep understanding, knowledge, or love for Star Wars, tend not to involve themselves in these arguments at all. They're the vast grey blob in the middle who like the pretty lights and the spaceships and the laser swords, who thought the fight scene in the throne room looked kind of cool, and who viewed TLJ as a whole as a reasonably entertaining creation, albeit one they're not so invested in that they spend any significant time thinking it through. I think this section reveals the author as belonging to this type. Her attempted defense of the writing and plot structure and characterization in TLJ has all the hallmarks of thought-free appreciation. She writes, Johnson's grand tonal shift and unorthodox interpretation of The Last Jedi finds its strength when standing on its own. Instead of forcing itself to include Rey, Poe Dameron, and Finn to band together in one central adventure against the First Order, Episode 8 divides itself enough where each central protagonist is given a genuine, organic storyline to follow. Oh dear. It's possible, just about possible, to divorce oneself from the morally abysmal nature of this film, and to critique the writing objectively. And the writing is objectively bad, for precisely the reasons she sets out as being the film's strength, as we'll see. She continues, Rey, under Skywalker's guidance, is determined to discover her true lineage. Her persistence to trace her heritage back to her roots ultimately reminds her that being nobody is priceless. Star Wars continues to obsess itself with tangled family trees and overlapping relationships between primary characters. With Rey accepting her label of nobody, it promotes self-identity. The Last Jedi advocates for the fact that people can control their own fates or destinies without needing to credit their bloodline for social capital. Ren's verbal barrage often targets Rey's status as a scrapper from Jakku, as an attempt to belittle her, though she learns to overcome these taunts. She learns to overcome her identity crisis, and instead embrace who she is. The Last Jedi defeats the idea that labels are indicative of who someone is. It breaks past the constrictions of certain characters can only achieve so much. I think there's a word or two missing there, but that's the fault of the editors at MovieWeb, who apparently aren't being paid enough. Alternatively, they are being paid far too much. But again, overlooking the grammatical faults, it is, of course, important to omit all we now know as a result of the rise of Skywalker.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
Since TLJ can't be blamed for JJ's clumsy retcons, except insofar as it was so bad he thought those retcons were necessary in the first place. But beginning with Rey, this little summary entirely defeats the point it's supposed to be making. Never mind that Luke in no way provides guidance, and has very little interest, if he has any at all, in Rey's lineage. And leaving aside that the film really doesn't do much with Rey's lineage until the big reveal at the end, she absolutely does not realize that being nobody is priceless. To the extent she is persistent in tracing her roots, the big reveal undermines that entire subplot by utilizing what, in literary technique, is called bathos with a B. B as in bath or buggery. It's practically a synonym for anticlimax, the decline of something with serious weight, often something with pathos, with a P as in penis, or emotional significance, to the mundane and the banal. Often it happens by accident, but it is also a technical device when it's used consciously, and TLJ uses it at least semi-consciously. Semi-consciously and badly. The problem with bathos with a buggery, even where it is intended, is that it can very often leave the audience thinking, well, what the fuck was the point of all that? And this likelihood increases, and its severity increases, in direct proportion to the consequences of the reveal and how much weight was given to the build-up. In Rey's case, one of the bigger questions left open by TFA was indeed the question of her lineage. The reviewer cites family trees and overlapping relationships between primary characters as a problem, which is odd, as these things, especially relationships between primary characters, define characters in fiction as they define people in real life. It's what reveals and develops their characters, it's what creates the stakes, it's what makes them interesting. I challenge the author to name any of her favourite books, TV series or films which do not feature overlapping relationships between primary characters. I assume also that she has friends, even if she does write for MovieWeb, who are important to her. Does this make her personal story more or less interesting? Citing family trees is again an odd criticism to make of the prior installments in the Star Wars franchise, when the sequel trilogy was and is explicitly billed as the conclusion of the Skywalker saga. Family is integral to Star Wars. I don't know a single person who would say of Empire Strikes Back that Vader's big reveal as Luke's father made that film worse. You can say, and it would be tenable, that the attempt to shoehorn in the sequel trilogy to the Skywalker saga was a mistake. I would agree. But it was the point of the sequel trilogy. It was a continuation, it was not a new start. Defending The Last Jedi for being nihilistic about its own reason for being is an odd choice of argument. Of course, JJ subsequently deciding that Rey was a Palpatine all along was farcical, but just as farcical was the use of bathos with a buggery by Ryan in attempting to make her lineage inconsequential. Again, this is subversion without point or purpose. It accomplishes nothing dramatically, save that bathos with a buggery we mentioned earlier, because if it was always inconsequential, what was the point of including it at all? There are ways to make it consequential, but TLJ doesn't do that. TLJ chooses one of the most hectic parts of the film in which to drop this reveal, and then it briskly moves on. It has absolutely no bearing on anything that comes after it. It changes nothing about Rey's character. It does not alter her mindset or her motivations
in any way.
There is no obvious resolution to any identity crisis, which was itself barely apparent to begin with. It's a redundancy, and in no guide to good writing will you find the inclusion of redundant plot lines, or lines in general, recommended. And this is far from the only instance where TLJ indulges in the redundant, as we'll see. But the author continues. Finn is treated as more than just an ex-stormtrooper, just as Dameron is appreciated more as a leader. Their character arcs are both insightful as they are nuanced. Individuality... What? Individuality, sick, they are both given more to do rather than existing for the sake of being disposable characters. Johnson is ready to appreciate the on-screen growth that he can give to them, and is determined to keep either of them involved. By keeping Finn and Dameron busy with their own missions, Johnson reminds the audience that they too deserve an equal amount of attention. He views them more than their occupations or as their assigned roles, looking past the box that they were once placed in. The pair is set into their own spotlights, where they can become more comfortable with themselves while facing their own challenges. I thought Disney nixed the gay subplot. Maybe she means comfortable with themselves in a different way. She continues, each strength and weakness is underscored, drawing out more about the character's personality as an individual. Compared to past characters that are banded together without further exposition, who? The Last Jedi prides itself on spending time with the sequel's main trio, though on their own. It instills the belief that individualism is to be appreciated without having to use group association as a personality trait. Let's unpack this. Keep in mind that one of the main criticisms of TLJ was that it chose not to take the opportunity to put Luke, Leia, and Han on screen at once, and that this criticism has been made even by people otherwise appreciative of the film, or at least those who don't hate it. It harks back to the author's bizarre criticism that the old Star Wars featured too many relationships between characters. The whole point of Star Wars is that it's a grand narrative which sweeps up all manner of people of disparate origins and backgrounds, compelling them to fight for a common cause, thereby revealing that they have much more in common than they could ever have imagined. Most great stories do this in some way. It is, again, integral to the formation and development of character. Han Solo is Han Solo because his arc in A New Hope shows us that this self-interested mercenary discovers values beyond the material. Again, friendship, love, and loyalty. At great risk and personal cost, he returns to the fray because he realizes there are things more important than money. The farm boy, the princess, and the smuggler develop together. Their characters are formed and strengthened by their interactions, by the way they are with each other, with the effect being that their differences actually make them more of a whole. They are distinct, but they are part of a trinity. In so doing, the OT overcomes the problem the author claims to have identified, that of family lineage. Yes, it is the Skywalker saga, and Luke's relationship with his father is one of the defining features of the arc. But Luke, Han, and Leia are a family of their own. Literally, as we find out later in the case of Luke and Leia, but also figuratively, then made literal when Han and Leia hook up. But Luke knows none of this when he's training on Dagobah and receives his vision of his friends in pain. He leaves Yoda, he abandons his training, against the advice of his most influential mentor, to go and rescue them, and it almost costs him his life. Family is front and center, but it's the broad definition of family, the one that encompasses your closest friends and loved ones, irrespective of blood ties and lineages. Once again, the OT represents the precise opposite traits to those attributed it by the author. Her defense of TLJ is that it takes the opposite approach, but that's why it doesn't work, not why it does. And what, if any, consequence results from splitting up the new trio? Finn and Rose's side quest to Canto Bight is widely and correctly reviled, because it's pointless, not because it achieves anything. It's literally irrelevant to the plot. You could skip it entirely and absolutely nothing would change. It takes up a quite ridiculous portion of the film, where they go to planet Vegas in search of a codebreaker, get captured, don't find the codebreaker, find some other guy with a hammed-up stutter and roughly similar skills, break out, free some rabbit horses. It's an extended anti-capitalist animal rights riff. This is not what you watch Star Wars for. They escape, they board the supremacy, they get betrayed by Stutter, and are only rescued because of the universe-breaking Holdo maneuver, of which more in due course. But they accomplish nothing. There is absolutely no consequence to this entire arc, save revealing Rose to be almost incomprehensibly shallow as a character. Knowing that they failed in their mission, and so all their friends, and the Resistance itself, and perhaps even the entire galaxy are doomed, they free the rabbit horses anyway, and Rose says, "Now it's worth it." How? In what world was that worth it? We learn practically nothing about Finn in this segment either, and the culmination of this arc is again Bathos, with her buggery. On Crate, when all seems lost, Finn goes to sacrifice himself for the greater good. For his friends. Again, not a motivation that could exist were it not for the overlapping relationships between primary characters that the author bizarrely laments. And this could have been good. It shows us so much about Finn. It's the logical conclusion of his arc. He has no other story. There is nothing left for the film to do with him. It reveals him to be fundamentally good, dedicated, loyal, to have overcome the doubts and the cowardice that plague him in The Force Awakens. He's prepared to end his own life so that his friends might live. He's not going to run anymore. He will die so that they can succeed. He is prepared to martyr himself. Martyrdom being one of the most symbolically powerful things any character, in fiction or in life, can do, irrespective of the cause of that martyrdom. The cause determines whether it's good or bad. The act itself is immensely powerful, whatever the cause. And he's about to do it. He's committed to it. Only for fucking Rose, with no character, no story, no meaningful motivation or relevance to the plot, to fucking ruin it. Again, making the entire thing completely redundant. Topped off with one of the most ridiculous lines ever delivered in film.
That's how we're gonna win. Not fighting what we hate. Saving what we love.
The author attempts to argue that TLJ is morally complex. I now realize, have spared both you and I a lot of time and merely played this line without explanation, because it's self-evident proof that her argument is nonsense. This is the film's idea of moral complexity. It's like an introduction to ethics written by Mighty fucking Cyrus. There is no complexity here. And all we get from Poe Dameron's arc is the elevation of Admiral Holdo at his expense. The film takes the greatest pilot in the Resistance and sets it up so that he is unable to demonstrate any of that talent. Instead, he is locked aboard ship in a nonsensical chase sequence that takes up 2/3 of the film. The First Order fighters, which have just blown up the bridge, are then withdrawn because they can't do enough damage to the ship and the First Order can't cover them. The First Order famously caring a great deal about the fate of its pirates. None of them are indispensable. It's a really caring organization. The First Order ships cannot outpace the Resistance ships, but they're also not so slow that they can't keep up, so they move at exactly the same speed. None of them hyperspaces ahead, so that the Resistance fleet runs into them. They all decide to tail the Resistance until they run out of fuel, despite them being in space, and so having no need of fuel to maintain their momentum. They have no weapons that can penetrate the Resistance ships from range, though later, on Crate, they deploy miniaturized Death Star tech, which just begs the question, why the hell did they not have slightly less miniaturized Death Star tech on the Supremacy? You could certainly fit one on it. It has about 3 million people aboard. It is ridiculously large. That seems like a design oversight on the Supremacy's part. Poe is repeatedly belittled by Dr. Sattler from Jurassic Park, who has a plan up her sleeve, but refuses to tell anyone what it is, forcing Poe to take matters into his own hands in a bid to save the Resistance from Dr. Sattler, who has given him no reason to suppose she is anything other than flotsam, drifting without plan or purpose. This makes her one of the worst military leaders in history. And her plan... But, I mean, has any single military maneuver caused more damage to the fabric of the universe with one move? This is... It's broken. And we don't even have to get onto the fact that we now know from The Rise of Skywalker that it's a 1 in a million, which is another of those fantastically lazy attempts at retconning that JJ was essentially forced into, because otherwise, why wouldn't they just hyperspace into any Imperial capital ship? Because that's such an effective tactic. Anyway, Poe's insurrection is almost comically crushed. He's dumped on one of the escape shuttles, and then he's a spectator from this point on. All his development happens in the first third of the film, before he's split off from Finn, in his argument with Leia over his costly plan to destroy the First Order dreadnought. The author claims that his individual arc allows his character to develop, but it doesn't develop beyond what was established after the opening scene. We already knew he was headstrong and independent and even reckless. His individual arc does not develop on these points at all, it just reiterates them. And once again, its culmination does not affect the plot at all. It is, again, inconsequential. It is, again, pathetic. It is, again, redundant. Closing her review, the author reprises the idea that anything different must, axiomatically, be good. She writes that as innovative as Star Wars is, it sometimes catches itself in an endless formulaic loop. Johnson was prepared to approach the franchise from a new point of view, and his diversity in Star Wars storytelling allowed the franchise to push itself to new lengths. There was the acceptance that morality is fluid, and not as rigid as it was once presented. There was a deeper study of character motivations that Set overlooked, the textbook definitions of right and wrong? What is it with missing words in these sentences? Johnson crafted a screenplay that was willing to take chances and exist outside of expectations. He was unashamed to trek into uncharted thematic territory that was only a what-if lingering from past Star Wars entries. The Last Jedi was responsible for sacrificing tradition for progression, in retrospect, to the original and prequel trilogies. Once again, overlooking the fact that the editors at MovieWeb either are not paid enough or are paid far too much, this argument is entirely void. We've already set out why difference is not axiomatically good, why the film's attempts at moral complexity barely even qualify as attempts, why the screenplay did not, in fact, result in a deeper study of character motivations. The idea that nothing is right or wrong is one of the most insidious excuses for thought ever to plague a culture. It's simply untrue. Yes, there is such a thing as moral ambiguity in the real world, and competently written works of fiction can do great things with the grey space between the moral poles. The prequel trilogy, for all its faults, did this reasonably well. Yes, the Confederacy is presented as villainous and contains characters who are objectively evil. There's that word again. But the premise of the prequels is that the Republic and the Jedi Order are themselves morally dubious. You can even make a convincing argument that the Confederacy was in the right in the prequels, Count Dooku especially, that this was a worthy cause being manipulated by Palpatine, not a bad cause sincerely pursued. After all, had the Confederacy won, Palpatine's plans would have been foiled, the centralized authority he required to create his empire having collapsed. The whole concept of the anti-hero exists because this grey space exists, and anti-heroes are some of the most interesting characters in fiction. Once again, I'd be inclined to cite Count Dooku, who is one of the more interesting villains in the franchise because he's not, in fact, stereotypically evil. He is, as even the Jedi acknowledged, an idealist, not a murderer. He left the Jedi Order because he saw the contradictions under which it was collapsing and could not persuade it to enact the changes necessary to save itself. But the existence of moral ambiguity and grey space does not disprove the existence of moral rights and wrongs, subjectively or objectively. You can hold to the view that morality is fundamentally subjective, that there is no absolute underpin or overarching purpose and intelligence required to make it actually absolute, whilst also recognizing that said underpin and purpose are not necessary for people to act as if their morality is absolute, to genuinely believe that it is. Belief, fervent belief, is all that's required to make morality de facto absolute, even if ultimately it is subjective. Typically, the more extreme the force, the more stark the choice, and the more the moral question is amenable to questions of absolute. In the fight between the Resistance and the First Order, like the rebels against the Empire before it, the choice is so stark as to be practically absolute. Sometimes Godwin's law must be broken. TLJ's approach to moral ambiguity is akin to saying that there is alarmingly little moral difference between the Allies and the Nazis because they sourced their weapons from the same or similar places. This is not moral complexity, this is moral relativism, even moral nihilism. We see the same thing today with people who attempt to excuse the crimes of Islamic State or the Taliban or Al-Qaeda or Communist China or the Soviet Union because the USA is not itself morally perfect. Some people pretend that this is clever, and some dupes actually believe that it is. But it isn't. It does not reflect moral complexity, it just reveals that you have no understanding of moral complexity. The author makes a good point, albeit not very well, when she writes, J.J. Abrams was criticized for not having a plan when approaching the trajectory of the sequel trilogy. It kept itself bound to what would be viewed as acceptable by a general audience. There was a distinct absence of originality that was substituted for nostalgia when The Force Awakens, as it was strikingly similar to A New Hope. Honestly, I think I might just give up pointing out these abysmal dropped words. The Force Awakens, what? As it was? As? I don't know. Anyway, it's all fine and true to the extent we can understand it, but she goes on to say, it became a glaring concern that Abrams would settle with gratifying a collective fandom over refining Star Wars into a more analytical piece of commentary. With the franchise working as an observation on the non-fictitious world that influences it, Episodes 6 and 9 failed to be seen as provocative. Johnson's frame of reference acted more as an introspectively inquiring installation in the series. It wanted to overcome the obvious by applying more unexpected, nearly intrusive themes. The writer-director's disruptive approach to Star Wars was what the franchise was in dire need of. Honestly, much of this is just incomprehensible. The franchise working as an observation of the non-fictitious world that influences it? Does she mean the real world? Because if so, that's what she should have said. But to the extent it is comprehensible, it is flatly wrong. The author is not in a strong position to criticize fans of old Star Wars, given, as we showed in the last video, she demonstrably doesn't understand it, and it's questionable whether she's actually seen much of it. The idea that the choice was between memberberry juice and innovation, between cheap and lazy fan service and creating something new, is a false dichotomy. Many people are now turning to the memberberries because of TLJ's so-called innovation, but that isn't to say they wouldn't have wanted to see something new, provided what was new was actually good. Generally speaking, fans' knowledge of all the intricacies and all the extensive lore that could make for something that's both new and good and nostalgic increases in direct proportion to their love of the series. Ask anyone with even a passing familiarity with the old expanded universe, and there's a good chance you'll hear them ask incredulously why the sequels didn't take the Thrawn arc, for example, as their basis, a story that links to the old, which continues from the old, but which is entirely new, the logical next step in the grander Star Wars saga. It did not trade innovation for nostalgia, it married them. And it didn't suffer from 30 years of absent world building, which plagued the sequels. Still, to this day, I have no idea where the First Order came from, I have no idea where they got their resources, I have no idea why nobody opposed them when they moved back into the galaxy, I have no idea what their relationship was with the Galactic Republic, I have no idea if the Galactic Republic was aware of them. I am aware that some of these things are explained in deleted scenes, and I am likewise aware that they have attempted posthumously, or post-haste at least, to write some of these things in accompanying novelizations. I refuse to read these things, because this is cheating. If you put some inconsequential, irrelevant, nonsensically written pap onto the screen, which people point out is nonsensical, and after that you go and write some kind of comic book, or some kind of low circulation novel, which fills in all of the stuff that you didn't have time or you couldn't be asked to fill in at the time, no, that is the wrong way around. That does not redeem the film. If you cannot include that in the film, then that is a fault with the film. You can develop on points made in the film, but you should not have to read a side novel in order to understand what the hell is going on in the world you're depicting on screen. This is a basic point of principle, and most fans abide by it, whether they realize it's a point of principle or not. Anyway, the idea that being provocative was TLJ's first and last duty is simply asinine. Plenty of things are provocative and bad, even disgusting. Drawing swastikas on synagogue walls and throwing bacon at Muslims is provocative. Drag queens giving lap dances to children is provocative. Consciously and deliberately destroying the character of Luke Skywalker is provocative. Provocation qua provocation is morally and valuatively neutral. The question is cause. The question is purpose. That's what determines whether the provocation is good, bad, right or wrong, legal or illegal. It is not a defense of TLJ to simply state that it's provocative. You have to say how, and you have to say why, and you have to back that up in an argument. The author has done a patchy job of the first two, and completely failed at the third, given that her argument could just as easily apply and justify me squatting on her doorstep and laying a log. That would be provocative, darling. She continues, Episode 8 avoided enforcing the crowd-pleasing tactics employed by Star Wars in order to captivate a dedicated fan community. Now, am I reading this correctly? I might not be reading this correctly because it's terribly written, and it's sometimes hard to ensure that you've taken the right meaning from a poorly constructed sentence, but assuming that I have got the gist of it, she's already admitted that it's one of the most divisive entries in the entire franchise. TLJ alienated many more dedicated fans than it won. Dedicated fans by and large hated it. The only people who seem to have enjoyed it are those with political points to make, those with sort of high status opinions, and those who are able to enjoy it because they are not dedicated and so do not particularly care about the history and the characters TLJ traduces. She writes that what allowed The Last Jedi to earn its reputation was that it wanted to be recognized as an outlier. Johnson's nonconformist vision was what generated such strong, polarized reactions to The Last Jedi. There was the intention of creating a Star Wars film that left a lasting impact and questioned the overall redundancy of themes in the series. The significance of The Last Jedi, being continuously subject to debate over its quality, satisfies Johnson's ambitions for the film. It generates conversation over good or bad, the exact subject that Johnson sets out to destroy. The Last Jedi raised the question why, while leaving the answer open-ended for personal interpretation. Well, it certainly was recognized as an outlier, but for all the wrong reasons. For all the reasons laid out in this response, and a galaxy's worth I've not had time to include. But the point about the so-called redundancy of themes in the series is worth redressing. The author hasn't actually mentioned any of these, besides those about family and relationships that we've already rebutted, and I think convincingly. If jettisoning the established themes of the series has led to the kind of mass disenfranchisement she acknowledges has occurred, to say nothing of the disenchantment which it undoubtedly has, then in what sense were these themes redundant? Good writing is a universal wand. Good characters likewise. Established characters as totemic or iconic as Luke Skywalker serve an additional purpose. They're the vessels of our emotions as well as our real-life histories. Everyone above a certain age remembers where and when they first encountered him. People younger than that, myself included, literally do not remember a time when he wasn't one of our heroes. His character is the embodiment of his story, and his story is, profoundly meaningful to millions, if not billions, of people. He was our introduction to a whole universe, a universe that, in important ways, let our values, our hopes, our fears, and our emotions in too. Aristotle wrote of the cathartic effect of art, which allows us to imbue characters with the most important parts of ourselves, and, to some extent, to live vicariously through them. An attack on such a character, never mind the wanton destruction of that character, is not merely an attack on something other, something apart, something we are merely aware of, that we see from a distance. It's an attack on parts of our memory, on those bits of our psyche we have imbued that character with. It's not dissimilar in effect to an attack on one's mother or father or best friend. We take it personally, because our persons are in that character and would not be without that character. And on the point of the broader themes, the question arises in another form. In a world and a society so profoundly racked by division, so lacking in anything like a unifying message or set of values, what we have left, barely, is a faint memory of a time when we did have unifying messages and sets of values. Star Wars came about at a time when the world was split between East and West, when we were mere minutes away from destroying ourselves over ideological disagreements. But fiction can transcend these differences. Fiction can free us of the immediacy of political arguments and remind us what it is we have in common. A love of stories, a love of meaning, a love of people who, like us, seem irrelevant in the great turning of the world, but who can overcome whatever odds by courage, determination, grit, cunning, and, once again, friendship, love, and loyalty. These are the themes Star Wars represents, or used to. Can you honestly say, can anyone honestly say, that these things are redundant? Can you honestly say that we've been improved by TLJ's subversion of these themes and ideals? Can you honestly say, can any defender of TLJ honestly say, that we are better off for having had the franchise dragged down to the real murky bog of the 21st century than we would have been had it remained as it was, something above us to aspire to? Is this really progress? The author concludes that Rian Johnson entered the Star Wars universe knowing that living beings do not stringently experience life through a single point of view and are shaped by their experiences. The concept is not alien to the franchise, but was only truly invited to influence the series in its prequel series. Johnson authorizes himself to rework this concept into the sequels through The Last Jedi. And that being incomprehensible, and 100% wrong wherever it is comprehensible, is a pretty neat summation of the argument, or lack thereof. And so, I think that's where we will leave it. But thank you for sticking with us. I hope you enjoyed the video. Make sure you like and subscribe for more.
Are you alright? What's wrong?
I felt a great disturbance in the Force, as if millions of voices suddenly cried out in terror and were suddenly silenced. I fear something terrible has happened.